I thought the topic today is tips for successful glazing, and so I thought what I do is these are sort of general tips. And I know there are usually a lot of issues with glazing, so if you have questions, please bring them up. Whether we touch on them or not. I just made a list. Some of these are just sort of general hints that I found out over the years. So it may not be specifically like how you glaze the inside of the spout of a pitcher, and if you have a specific question, let's talk about it. But some of these are just sort of general ideas. And I've broken it down a little bit somewhat into the different areas or the different steps that you do in glazing. So, in terms of glaze preparation and this sort of thing. So we'll talk about it sort of in that order. And I guess the first thing I wanted to mention, which I've taught at a number of studios and been in a number of studios over the years, and and it's almost like an obvious comment, but the biggest thing I found when people talk about the fact that they have problems with glazing is take your time. So many people that I've run into basically don't like glazing, so they tend to rush through it, and they put all this time into making the pot, and whether it's hand building or wheel throwing, and trimming it, and all that, and then they sort of get to the point that I just want to get it glazed and get it, so they sort of want to sort of forget the fact, and so they rush through it. And to me, if you really want to get good results and you want to get the dividends of all the time you've put in on the pot earlier, you really need to take your time. And so it takes some discipline, especially if you hate glazing, to do it. But it really is worth it because it does require a lot of attention to detail. And to me, you can take a good pot and really louse it up with a bad glazing job. I mean, you can take a beautiful pot and really screw it up badly if you don't glaze it. Take your time and do the same attention to detail that you've done up to that point. The other thing I found that's really useful in terms of screwing up or not screwing up pots is do small-scale tests ahead of time. Don't do your testing on your pieces that you love. And I do this a lot. If I'm doing a series or working on a piece of work, I'll do small-scale tests ahead of time. I'll make little maquettes, which are small, like clay sketches, or I'll make test pieces. And I'll test the glazes, or I'll test the decoration that I want to do, or the glaze combinations, or the colors, or all of those things on the test pieces first. So I'll have made my piece maybe in its bisque fiber, and then I'll say, okay, now I'm going to stop. And I'm not going to rush through the glazing, and I'll do some tests to really decide what, the glaze effects that I have in mind, are they going to work on this piece? So I would really recommend that. Maybe I go to excess on the testing just because I like testing. But I found it really helps to step back a bit and don't test it on, don't say, well, I think I'll try this, and then when it doesn't come out, you put all that time into, maybe what you otherwise think is a really nice piece. So I think it's really worth it, I think, to do some small-scale tests. The other thing I try to do, for example, is whenever I do a glaze firing, I always have tests in the glaze firing. I make it a point to say that I'm not going to do a glaze firing unless I'm testing for something else in that firing so that I can take advantage of the firing. So I've got different series that I'm working on in different stages so that I may be doing the finished firing of one series and I'm doing some preliminary glaze tests for another series that I'm starting to work on that I have in mind. And I found that really helps. I just sort of make it a personal rule. I'm never going to do a glaze firing without testing something. Even if it's just a new glaze that I have no immediate application for, I'll say, okay, I've wanted to test that glaze for a while. I'll make it up now. I'll make up a swirl kind of, and I'll get it into this firing. And then that might give me even ideas as to if I get a glaze that isn't connected to a specific piece. It might give me ideas for work that I might say, wow, this might look great on this kind of work. So that might even be a springboard for some work, and now I've already got a glaze test to sort of inspire me and give me some direction. So I found it, anyway, really useful. The other thing is that I think is really helpful is you really need to know or learn your glazes. You need to know just about the glazes themselves. And you're, I'm sure, familiar with this, but different glazes work better on different clays. So it isn't just not every glaze works on every single clay body. So you need to really need to do enough testing and use of a glaze to know what that glaze does. Does the glaze tend to run? How does it work for overlaps? Does it work on top of another glaze but not under a glaze? Those kind of, the sort of the peculiarities of a glaze. I mean, you're probably familiar with when I say work better on different clays. Like Randy's Red, for example, you may have all heard of, common clay, works better on colored clays. You don't get nice color on white clays. That's the way that glaze works. So you need to know that. Cone 10, if you do cone 10 gas firing, like for copper reds, they work much better on porcelains than on colored clays. So you need to know that. If you want to get really nice copper red, reduction copper reds, they do much better on porcelain than on the colored clays, because the iron, in this case, the iron from the clay comes in and alters the effect of the color. And you don't get the bright reds on stonewares that you do on porcelains, for example. So again, that's something you need to know about the glaze. And you also need to know, for example, excuse me, copper reds run. So they flow a lot more than other glazes. So that you need to think about, okay, where am I going to place the copper red glaze on the pot? Keeping in mind that I know it's going to run. And in order to get copper reds also, again, I'm picking on copper reds because it's a good example, is that copper reds need to be applied thicker than most other glazes. So you're fighting two things. In order to get good copper color, they need to be applied thicker than other glazes. But when you apply them thicker, they're going to run more. So you have to know that. So if you're after the copper red color, you have to think about placement. Where can I put them? Where if they do flow a little bit, that'll be okay, because I need the extra thickness so that I can get the good copper color. And that's just the glaze characteristics. That has nothing to do with what you need to do with the kiln in terms of reduction atmosphere to get the right conditions for the reduction. Another example, the opposite direction, is like to know that most Shino glazes, everybody familiar with what Shino glazes? These are like high feldspar glazes, cone 10, classic Shinos. It's a classic Japanese. They don't run at all. They never run. So you don't. I mean, they do these weird things where they craze a lot and they crawl, and that's part of the aesthetic of the Shinos. But it's almost impossible to make a Shino run. I saw an example years ago of a Shino glaze. Now it had been multiply fired, but it had a Shino glaze that was over 1/4 inch thick on the pot, and it's just sitting there. And it was beautiful. It's sort of slightly textured, and they did multiple fires. You know, the potter put some on, fired it, put some more on as much as he could get on, fired it again. And the first didn't run when he put the second on, and the second didn't run when he put the third on. It never runs. So that's useful to know in terms of placement and where you can do it. It's not going to run. You can put it in the hottest part of the kiln, and it's not going to run.
Is it the feldspar?
It's the feldspar. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but when the glaze actually melts, it makes such a stiff melt that it barely moves. Which is also why it ends up with all these defects like the crazing and the crawling, because it doesn't flow out and heal the glaze. Like a lot of glazes, you get little pinholes or bubbles, and you want the glaze to flow, and if there's enough time in the kiln, you want it to heal all those little defects. And the melt that forms when Shinos melt is so stiff, it doesn't heal anything. So cracks and pinholes and bubbles and blisters and curl, they just stay there. So, and for instance, just as I mentioned also about running, while we're talking about that, another example of glazes that run more than others are these macrocrystalline glazes. You've probably seen those. These are the ones that have those sort of the giant rosettes of crystals. Those run like crazy, and they have to. Because in order to form the crystals, they have to have a composition that's very low in aluminum oxide, which means they're going to run like crazy. So if you like those macrocrystalline glazes, where you get those big rosettes of crystals, it's going to be, the glaze is almost like water when it melts. And so when people do that kind of firing, they actually have to make special little cups and feet that the pots sit on, and they're disposable. You end up knocking it off with a hammer and then grinding the bottom of the pot, because you just assume that the glaze is going to run right off the pot into some kind of a little catch basin. That's the only way. And if you stiffen the glaze so the running doesn't have it, you don't get the crystals. So you only get the crystals because the composition it happens to be a really runny composition. And that's why people that generally do macrocrystalline glazes, they sort of specialize in it because there are a lot of extra steps they have to do. They have to make separate little, almost like little stilts out of clay on the bottom that the glaze can run onto, and then you usually put a cup under that to catch the glaze. You'll end up literally with a pool of glaze, and then you have to take a hammer and you knock the stilts off the bottom, and then you grind the glaze off the bottom with the stilts were in contact with the pot. So another last point about in these sort of general things is something to keep in mind is design your pieces with the glazing in mind as much as possible. I mean, ideally, somebody told me this a long time ago, and it took a long time to sort of absorb it, but when you put the clay on the wheel and you're centering it, you should be thinking about how you're going to decorate the pot. And for things, for instance, like whatever it is, like how am I going to hold the pot, depending on what the form is? How am I going to hold it? Do I need, aside from design considerations, Do I need a sufficient foot ring? Let's say it's a bowl. Do I need, and I want to dip the rim, so then do I need to design a foot ring that I'll be able to hold and hold the bowl upside down in order to dip the rim? Or do I have a runny glaze? Do I need to include a groove, or at least a very prominent foot ring, that if the glaze runs more than I want to, I'll have a place to catch the glaze? So you really should be thinking about, this is another reason why it's really useful to work in series, where the idea was you don't just make a one-off, you work on a concept or an idea and you develop it and it evolves. But then you can think about things like this. It's like, okay, if I have a general idea about how I want to decorate these pots, what design features do I need to include to accommodate my glazing? Okay, so that's something to think about. It's like, are there sort of more technical considerations aside from aesthetics? Do I need to have something to hold the pot? Or let's say I'm doing a covered form. Am I creating a lip or something that's going to be difficult to get the glaze, when I pour the glaze out, it's going to be difficult to get the glaze out? Or is the glaze going to dribble on the side of the pot when I pour it out? And I'm going to have to clean up the dribbles. Can I design the rim in a different way so that when I pour the glaze out, it pours out cleanly? So does that mean maybe the inside of the rim has a little sharper cut on it and less rounded, so that I don't get like a pitcher that dribbles whenever you pour it? And it might be something that somebody wouldn't even notice when they look at the pot, but you build it in. So we're talking now about glaze compositions, or just comments about glazing related to glaze composition. One of the things that I don't think a lot of people realize is that even if you pick one firing temperature like cone 6, different recipes start to melt at very different temperatures. Very different temperatures. This relates to the firing schedule and how it shows up in the firing schedule. And I give you an example. For instance, like here's a recipe. I'll pass this around. This is a cone 6 glaze that I fired at 06. Okay, so you would say, okay, I don't expect much to have happened to it. And in this case, this is just a cone 6 amber, clear amber. And I just want to, this is what you normally would think of. This is a way under fired glaze, a cone 6 glaze fired at 06. And you can see the glaze is kind of powdery. It doesn't really rub off on your fingers too much. It's a little harder than when I applied it, but it still looks like a grossly underfired glaze. Okay. Here's a different recipe. The same thing. This is a cone 6 glaze fired at 06, and it's already pretty well melted at 06. And the thing is, different ingredients in the glaze recipe. So this is where actually, the more you get into glazes and you think about it, it really helps to understand and to look, and after a while to get some experience looking at the glaze recipe, because this will tell you maybe what you need to do in terms of how you can use them. For instance, when a glaze melts early, one of the things you have to think about is overlaps. If I have two glazes and one of them melts a lot earlier than the other one, that's going to affect the way those two glazes interact. And it also affects whether it's on top or on the bottom. But you've also probably heard this old sort of rule like, Shino first or expect the worst, or some version of that.
Yeah.
Which means that if you're overlapping something with Shino, you always want to put the Shino on first rather than put the Shino on top of the other glaze. And the reason for that is because usually the Shino starts to melt at a very different temperature than the other glazes. That's the reason for it. And that's true for a lot of glazes, is that some glazes, if the melting temperatures are about the same, you put them together and they're very compatible. And others not. Another reason, sometimes the effects of glazes that you like when you put one glaze over another, and have you ever seen it where you put, let's say, a white over another glaze, and the white kind of floats and becomes sort of like a veil or a froth? That's due to the different melting points of the glazes. That the first glaze is melting and it's sort of drifting, and the second glaze is kind of drifting apart. And when it's melted, it's already kind of separated a little bit because the first glaze is melted. So some of these things that happen in a way that you don't like may be related to this difference in the melting, or they may be of the things you do like. The reason why this one melted, looking at the recipes, this one that I held up first is just kind of a standard recipe. This is methylene sulfonite, whiting, EPK, silica, nothing special. This one has a lot of frit in it. Well, most frits that are used, which is powdered glass, most frits that are used in glaze recipes are earthenware temperature frits. So the frit component of this glaze is what started to melt at 06, even though it's a cone 6 glaze. So what that means is that this will continue to get heated up, and eventually all the other ingredients will combine with the part that's already melted, and I'll end up with a glaze that is mature at cone 6. But part of it, the frit, is already melting at 06. So the minute you see a glaze that has a frit in it, it means it's going to do this. It's going to start to melt early. Okay. Couple more things to think about in terms of when you're glazing is that the nominal cone rating for a glaze is only approximate. You know, we talk about these 3 firing ranges, like there's earthenware, low fire, there's cone 6, and there's high fire or cone 10. That doesn't mean anything, really. A cone 6 glaze is not a cone 6 glaze, is not a cone 6 glaze. All they mean, when they say this is a cone 6 glaze, especially when they label things commercially, or even the recipes in books. I've seen so many bad recipes in books. But just because you say cone 6, what you really mean is not cone 10 and not earthenware. And a lot of cone 6 glazes would be really great at cone 5, or even 4.5, or maybe 7. So you can't assume, especially if you're taking recipes out of a book, you can't assume that because it says cone 6, it really is exactly cone 6. I had a really good example a number of years ago. I saw a really nice satin white glaze that I really liked. Somebody had a sample of it, and they gave me the recipe, and they said it was cone 6 glaze, and I fired the cone 6, and it was terrible. It was partly translucent. It had some little bubbles and blisters in it, which right away suggested it had been overfired, and it wasn't satiny, and it wasn't even opaque. So it looked like it had been overfired. So I went back and I fired it. I had cones sitting right next to it, so I knew exactly what had happened to it. So I fired it at cone 5, and it was perfect. So one cone difference made all the difference, and it was beautiful. It was buttery and satiny and opaque and everything I'd seen. One cone difference made the difference. And yet, you know, this was just called a cone 6 glaze. Well, it wasn't a cone 6 glaze. It was a cone 5 glaze. So that's something to think about also, is that especially if you're pulling recipes from references or online or out of a book, just because they say it's cone 10 or cone 6 or whatever, don't assume that. Because there may be a slight variation. And because there are so many thousands of different glaze compositions, you wouldn't expect them to all fire exactly at a particular level. They can't, almost. A couple other comments about glaze compositions is that just keep in mind that any glaze with ash, with any kind of wood ash in it, or soda ash is going to be really caustic, and you got to watch your eyes. And you can burn your corneas because they are really, really caustic. You're probably aware that, you know, in the early days, soap was made by taking wood ashes and boiling and putting fat in it, and what you make is soap. And so it's lye. So a glaze that contains wood ashes or soda ash is incredibly caustic. It can burn your skin, and some people have more sensitive skin than others, and it can burn your skin or at least, you know, give you a skin irritation. But if you get in your eyes, it can really damage your eyes. Another comment just about glaze compositions in terms of this, it relates to the composition, but think about it in terms of firing. As you go from earthenware to cone 6 to cone 10, the glazes become less and less temperature sensitive as a general rule. Which means that earthenware glazes generally you have to hit it right on the nose or it doesn't come out right. A lot of cone 6 glazes are a little more tolerant. Maybe a cone or two or half a cone up and down doesn't matter. And cone 10 glazes, usually you can go a couple of cones up and down. And that's because of the general compositions of the glazes. So as you go higher up in temperature, they tend to be less temperature sensitive. So you don't have to be quite as careful about getting it right on the exact thing. But cone 6 glazes generally are a lot more in general now, are more temperature tolerant. They have a wider range than earthenware glazes. Earthenware glazes, you pretty much have to hit the cone right on the nose, or they're not going to come out. Okay, just again something to keep in mind. So if you're firing a cone, if you're firing different, let's say you're doing cone 6 and then you decide to try some earthenware, maybe you were able to tolerate a certain amount of, maybe your kiln had a hot top and a cold bottom, which was okay for your cone 6 firing. It might not be okay for your earthenware firing now, because one cone difference would be enough to make the glazes work or not work. Where you get away with it, maybe with cone 6. Okay. Just again, some more just general composition. If anybody's doing raw glazing or single firing, you need to have more clay in the glazes that you're putting on raw clay than you do normally to allow for the shrinkage of the glaze. Last thing I had here under compositions is that if you have a glaze that has a lot of clay in the recipe, this can very often lead to shrinkage and crawling. Crawling is one of the hardest defects to diagnose because there's so many things that can contribute to it. One of the things that can contribute to it is a high clay content in the glaze. Because what happens is, when you apply the glaze to the pot, there's a lot of clay. Clay holds a lot of water. So now the glaze tends to shrink a lot when it dries. And if it shrinks sideways, that's one of the conditions that leads to crawling. Because it shrinks sideways, it loses its bond to the clay underneath it. It isn't as well attached, and that can lead to crawling. It doesn't guarantee crawling, it can lead to it. So if you have a glaze, so this is where it really helps to have a glaze recipe also, if you can look at the glaze. And if you've got 30% clay in or something in a recipe, there's a good possibility that you could run into crawling. Okay, some comments about mixing and glaze prep. So now you're making your glazes. One of the things I recommend is really, if you're making your own glazes, dry blend the powders really thoroughly before you add them to the water. And this is really important if there's bentonite, speaking about bentonite, in the glaze. Because bentonite, when it gets wet, is really sticky and gooey. And one of the things that happens if you don't distribute and disperse the bentonite, you end up with white spots in your glaze. If you've ever made up a glaze, you end up with little sort of slightly matte white spots in the finished glaze. Those are lumps of bentonite that didn't get distributed. And so the way to solve that is, or way to help solve it is, really dry blend the powder as well to get the bentonite powder really distributed and broken up so you don't have any lumps of bentonite, and then that will help anyway. So as a general rule also, especially if you have a glaze that has a lot of clay, is when you're making the wet glaze, add the powder to the water. And so what I do is, I just made up one the other day. I look at the approximate volume I have of powder that I've just dry blended, and I take maybe a little half or only 2/3 of that amount of water, just eyeball it, and I'll sprinkle the powder into the water and stir it as I go. What that helps do is it helps eliminate lump formation. Yeah, you can get rid of the lumps later, but sometimes they can be a real pain to get rid of them. Maybe you have to screen it several times. So if you add the powder to the water, the powder kind of gets wetter, all the little particles get wetter, and it's less likely to form lumps. Another thing, okay, now you've made up your glaze and you've made the water. When I make up the glaze, I don't bring it right to the final consistency. I make it up to the point where I've screened it, but it's still thicker than I ever want to use it. I'll let it sit for a day or two, because all the little clay particles can't absorb all the water and everything that they want to right away, and it's going to get thicker if you let it sit. So there's no sense in adjusting it to the final glazing consistency right away, assuming you had the luxury and you're not doing it the night before. but if you can, if you have that luxury, let it sit for a day or two, let the little particles soak up some more water, and then do the final adjusting. Because otherwise, if you do it right away, you're going to find in a day or so it's going to get thicker because it will have absorbed more, the little particles will have absorbed more water. So just let it sit. And then as far as adjusting the thickness, you probably heard about the idea about specific gravity. Well, technically, specific gravity is the weight of something compared to the weight of an equal volume of water. That's the definition of specific gravity. But you don't have to get into all those number of things. There's a really easy way to do it. You take a little measuring cup or any little thing, and let's say you've made up a glaze, and it's the perfect consistency. You love the way it works, and now you're going to make up another batch. Okay. Well, what you do is you take the glaze that's perfect, and you take a certain amount of it, maybe a cupful or whatever, and you weigh it. And then whatever that weight is for that amount, that's what you shoot for in the future. So now I'm making up a new batch of the glaze, and I weigh it, and I take a cup of it, and I weigh it, and it's heavier than my previous weight. That means I don't have enough water. Because all the powders that you add into water are heavier than water. So if I have a mixture of powder and water that's heavier than what I want, it means I have too much powder and not enough water. Or if it's lighter than my reference weight, it means I have too much water and not enough powder. So I don't need to go into all the numbers. All I need to do is say, what do I need to do to make this new glaze, this cup of new glaze, weigh the same as this number that I had before? And that will give you the water and the powder proportions. Okay, you forget the numbers don't matter. This is an easy way to do it. And by the way, hydrometers were never made to use for glazing.